to resuming debate, the honourable member for Brantford-Brant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be sharing my time this morning with my honourable colleague from Mission Matski Fraser Canyon. It's an absolute honour and privilege to rise and reply to the speech from the throne. I listened very carefully to the speech and identified two concerning issues that I heard repeatedly knocking on thousands of doors during the past election campaign. Namely, the escalation of crime, particularly gun offences, and the failure of this Liberal government to prioritize a meaningful relationship with our Indigenous neighbours. Mr. Speaker, the safety and security of Canadians must be the top priority for this government. As a former Crown attorney, I am deeply concerned about the escalation of crime in Canada, and particularly in my riding of Brantford-Brant. Unfortunately, this topic was completely neglected in the throne speech, despite many details published by the Canadian Centre for Justice and Community Safety Statistics. The report shows that in 2020, Canadian police services reported over 2.2 million criminal code and other federal statute violations, of which 743 were homicides, which is 56 more than the previous year. Let me repeat that number: 743 people killed in Canada last year. And yet there is no plan to reduce the escalation of crime in this throne speech. Canadians deserve better. My riding deserves better. People want to feel safe and protected in their home and communities. And this Liberal government must stop playing politics and pushing its ideological agenda. It must fight crime and finally end these horrible trends in Canada. Mr. Speaker, the fact that crime was not addressed in the speech from the throne did not surprise me. If we could reflect on the Liberal government's track record on this issue, we would see that there is nothing new here. In 2019, the Liberal government, while having a majority in the House of Commons, put into effect Bill C-75, the Criminal Justice Bill. They were claiming that this bill was designed to reduce sentences for milder offences, but the reality was it implemented softer sentences for serious, violent crimes, including participation in an activity of a terrorist group, abducting a child, participation in activities of criminal organizations, just to name a few. In 2020, the same Liberal government tabled a bill colloquially known as the No More Jail Time for Criminals Bill, which proposed to reduce jail time for dangerous offenders. If implemented, it would have allowed individuals found guilty of horrific crimes like sexual assault, arson, and kidnapping to serve their sentence on house arrest instead of real jail. It would also remove mandatory jail time for anyone who commits robbery with a firearm, trafficking in crystal meth, and criminals who smuggle firearms across the Canada-US border. And when talking about the smuggling of firearms across the border, it is very concerning during the last session when the Liberal MPs, with the support of their loyal and faithful NDP friends, voted down the Conservative bill that had been designed to address the prevalence of smuggled weapons and the rise in gun crime. The soft on crime agenda is simply irresponsible and dangerous. This Liberal government must do better to ensure the safety and security for everyone wherever they live in Canada. Madam Speaker, for 6 years, throne speech after throne speech, we heard the same rhetoric. The government is going to get handguns and assault weapons off the street. We have to focus on reducing gun violence, that we've seen the devastating effects of gun violence, too many lives lost, too many families shattered, time to show courage and strengthen gun control. The government will invest to help cities fight gang-related violence. And now, in 2021, our throne speech makes one opening statement that we're going to ensure, the Liberal government will ensure that they'll take steps to allow our communities to be safe. Madam Speaker, during the election campaign, the Prime Minister promised to give $1 billion to provinces and territories that want to ban handguns. But the reality is this will not lower gun violence, as almost 80% of the guns used to commit crimes in Toronto, for example, were illegal handguns originating in the United States. As quoted in the press recently, since criminals aren't deterred by the criminal code, it's a given they won't be deterred by any provincial legislation or municipal bylaws. The Prime Minister and his government knows this. Its 2018 paper by Public Safety Canada, known as Reducing Violent Crime, a dialogue on handguns and assault weapons, reported that the vast majority of owners of handguns and other firearms in Canada lawfully abide by requirements, and most gun crimes are not committed with legally owned firearms. That any ban of handguns or assault weapons would primarily affect legal firearm owners. The jurisdictions differ in their approaches to controlling handguns and assault weapons, and the data does not conclusively demonstrate that these handgun or assault weapons bans have led to any reductions in gun violence. The former Minister of Public Safety and former Toronto Police Chief told the Globe and Mail in 2019 banning handguns wouldn't work because most illegal guns are smuggled into Canada from the United States. The former minister was quoted as saying, quote, "I believe that would be potentially a very expensive proposition, but just as importantly, it would not be perhaps the most effective measure in restricting the access that criminals would have to such weapons, because we would still have a problem with them being smuggled across the border." The Prime Minister is now poised to reintroduce legislation that died on the order paper when the election was called last August, to remove minimum sentences for many gun-related offenses, including robbery with a firearm, discharging a firearm with intent, reckless discharge of a firearm, and possession of a prohibited or restricted firearm with ammunition. Madam Speaker, this is another example of this government's soft on crime agenda and will not reduce gun crime. The Prime Minister and his government are completely tone deaf on what it takes to keep our communities safe. It's time to target the real source of the problem. It's time to take bold and decisive action to strengthen our borders, provide the maximum support to our Canadian border agents, and work in partnership with the U.S. authorities and stem the tide of illegal smuggling of firearms. Madam Speaker, on September the 30th, I proudly attended the ceremony on Parliament Hill and stood shoulder to shoulder with Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians, reflecting and honoring the victims and survivors of the residential school system. The good people of Brantford-Brant sent me to Ottawa for this purpose. I am honored to represent my riding, which includes the largest First Nations reserve in Canada. On the day of truth, reflection, and reconciliation, Madam Speaker, I did not take a personal day and spend it on a beach. This year's throne speech was delivered by the Honourable Mary Simon, the first Indigenous person ever to hold the position of the Governor-General in Canada. As Canadians, we are very proud of this historical moment. This past summer, the collective consciousness of all Canadians were shocked and saddened with the discovery of unmarked graves at the sites of former residential schools. It is our collective responsibility to accept the truth and reflect on the failed and tragic policies of our previous leaders. 6 years ago, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission presented its final report. It presented 94 calls to action that would help redress the legacy of residential schools and advance the process of Canadian reconciliation. Under the watchful eye of this Prime Minister, the Liberal government has failed to implement the vast majority of them. According to a 2020 status update on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission call to action, conducted by the Yellowhead Institute, only 8 actions have been implemented. It would take at least 2062 to complete all 94 calls. Madam Speaker, I am honored to represent my riding, which includes the largest First Nations reserve. Throughout my entire life, and especially during the campaign, I had many opportunities to discuss a myriad of issues that people on reserves are facing every day. And as their representative in Ottawa, I will fight tooth and nail for their interests and my other...
Sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. The honourable member, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for St. Catharines.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for his speech. It's interesting he talks about being tone deaf as we're nearly on the eve of the anniversary of École Polytechnique, and he's talking about re-legalizing military-style assault weapons. But I would like to focus on his one mention. He mentioned 80% of illegal firearms being used, illegal firearms. And if we were to accept his statistic that it's 80%, why is he willing to write off 20% of homicide victims? If there isn't an in his own statistic, there's an opportunity to have a significant dent in the homicide rate. Why doesn't he want to take that action, and why is he writing these victims off?
Honourable member for Brantford-Brant.
Madam Speaker, I thank my friend opposite for his question, and quite frankly, it was offensive, given my background prior to me being elected as a parliamentarian. I have enjoyed 18 years as the representative of Her Majesty prosecuting crime in Brantford-Brant, and I take crime extremely serious, and I fought every day for victims to ensure that their rights were heard. The quote, it's very rich that my friend is asking me now to answer a question. But in any event, that quote was not my quote. That quote came from the Toronto Sun. It's an alarming figure. We have to take steps now. Enough with the platitudes. Come up with a concrete action to deal with this issue.
Yes, and I do want